Let me just ask you a question. Let's just pose a scenario here. Okay, it's next fall. It's late November, probably somewhere in there. BSU is undefeated in conference. Their final home game, and again, just play along. Let's say their final home game is Nevada, who's also undefeated. Final home game for the Mountain West title. And I tell you Sunday morning, and then BSU wins the game in a close one. It's a crazy game. And I tell you Sunday morning, I went to BSU's game last night. We went and tailgated for a while before. The game was good. We won. What all did I tell you? What all do you think? Do you fill in any gaps there? I mean, if I say I went to the game and tailgated, what do you think? There was food. What else? Trucks, a bunch of trucks backed around with tailgates open. A lot of people. What else? You're obsessed with football. I go to the game, and I say, yeah, it was a pretty good game. Maybe you watched it on TV. What gaps are you filling in? The score. There's a lot of crowd, the crowd noise, the fans are into it, the student section's into it. And then it took us a little while to get home. What are you filling in? Traffic was terrible. Okay? So what I'm saying is, I could tell you about that event in 4 sentences, but you would know a whole lot of other stuff without me saying anything. I wouldn't have to say, yeah, we went to the game where we got off on the connector and then there was some traffic. So that I wouldn't have to say any of that. You'd go, oh yeah, probably a lot of traffic. I'd say we went tailgating. You wouldn't have to go, I wonder what happened there. I mean, some of you might not know what tailgate, but even if I said we went and hung out with some people and grilled some food and there was a lot of people, you could fill in the gaps. The game, you could fill in the gap. When Jesus tells these parables, Jesus doesn't have to give every minute detail. When Jesus says, a certain man had 2 sons, and the youngest came to him and said, Father, give me my inheritance. You would know, as a Jewish person standing in that crowd, a whole lot of things. Dana taught last week and talked about the son making that demand. So we're kind of in 2 phases with the son right now. One is your iDrive needs to back up. That's the first phase. The first phase is he basically just says, give me what you can right now. And I'm sure as Dana talked about last week, what the son's demand there was complicated. I mean, he put his dad in a bad situation. There's a whole lot that has to happen. We read it as a sentence. Give me my portion of the inheritance. And the father gives it to him. But the listeners of that day would fill in a lot of information. They'd be like, he did what? He asked for... What he's saying basically is, I just want to leave. I want out of this family. I want to go away. And that's phase 1 that Dana talked about last week. What he even asks of his father is insulting. Culturally, it would be unbelievable for the people in that audience to hear this, Jesus tell this. And again, remember, there's an audience, but Jesus' audience is the scribes and the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, who have accosted him by saying, this man eats and spends time with tax collectors and sinners. And Jesus responds by telling these stories. So this opening statement, or this opening idea, would certainly convey the message that this is a bad kid who is insulting to his father, who just wants to run away. So now we're going to move into phase 2, which is going to be the despicable way he lives his life. And again, I've said this over and over, and I'll say it probably a whole lot more. I'm going to ask you to use some imagination, to put yourself in those listeners' shoes, to hear what they would hear when Jesus makes these statements that we have recorded as, I think, 11 sentences. What they would hear would just turn their stomachs, especially the Jewish leaders. Think of what you would think even today, though. If a friend of yours or a family member or somebody came to you and said, yeah, our 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old son said, Hey, I know I've got a trust fund. I want that right now. I'm going to move away. And maybe you think, maybe you even know this young person is maybe a little bit irresponsible, kind of has their own, wants to do their own thing. What would you think? I mean, just as your friend comes and tells you, little Jimmy has decided he wants to move away, and we had, $35,000 in a fund for him that he was supposed to be for college, said he doesn't want it for college, and he's moving to Vegas. What did you just think? Some of you laughed. What did you just think?
That money's going to be gone like that.
It's going to be a bad situation. Jesus says, a man had 2 sons. The younger of them, this is Luke 15, verse 11. Younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me. So he distributed the assets to them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had and traveled to a distant country where he squandered his estate in foolish living. See, we get that. We get that idea when somebody says, son, daughter wants their money, they're going to live in some place far away. It's not a huge leap for us to go, ooh, that's not going to turn out well. And that's exactly what Jesus' listeners would have thought. And, Dana, I'm sure, talked about last week. What the son basically says to his father is, I wish you were dead. I'm treating you as though you're dead. Give me my money. Now, as we look at this idea of him running away, this shameful way that he's conducting his life, when the text says not many days later, what that tells us is, and again, Jesus' listeners would hear this and go, so he fast-tracked this. He got, and Dana probably talked last week about what the father's going to have to assess all his owning, everything he owns, get an approximate value for it, and then he's going to have to say, okay, son, it's going to be about this much. And, well, we'll get to that in a minute. But what the son basically does is he liquidates everything. He gets cash, and he just leaves. He just says, this is what I want. I'm checking out of the family. I'm going to take everything that should be mine as my family inheritance, and I'm just going to cash it out. This in and of itself, I mean, just that action of cashing out his family inheritance would be reprehensible. When Ahab goes to Naboth and wants his vineyard, what does Naboth tell him? He says, no way I would do that before God. No way I would sell my family's land. That's just not, we don't do that. We don't sell what is our family's. And what's interesting with all of this is, number one, the kid probably lost a ton of value. I mean, had he just kept it till it was actually going to be his, it would be worth a whole lot more.
It also depends on where they are in the year of Jubilee.
Right.
Because if they're closer to the year of Jubilee, they're going to get much less for the property because it's going to revert back to the original owner after that 50 years. But if they're 50 years away from it, they're going to get a lot more value.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I had a paragraph in a book. Oh, no, I did bring it. So now I do get to sound like I know what I'm talking about. Let me read you this paragraph. I don't like to do this usually, but that's just like what Adam said. This is so interesting. This is from John MacArthur's book, A Tale of Two Sons, where I kind of got a ton of this information. But the whole idea of how this works is a little bit foreign to us. So I'm just going to read this because it explains it a lot better than I could. Family lands were protected by these laws, the law of Moses, protected by these laws so that no clan ever lost its property if one family member foolishly decided to squander his fortune away. In Leviticus 25:23, the Lord says, the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. As we noted earlier in the previous lessons, land sales in Israel were therefore more like long-term leases. And that's what Adam's hitting at. It's the idea that your family has this for that 49-year period. The year of Jubilee, things change. Things shift up a little bit. Like I said, we don't quite understand that. Family properties were redeemable, And land would revert to the original owner's family in the year of Jubilee. The Jubilee years occurred every half century at the end of 7 cycles of Sabbath years per Leviticus 25. The closer you got to the next Jubilee year, the less money you could get for the land. Furthermore, because of the tradition that prohibited a son from disposing of his father's property during the father's lifetime, we talked about that last week, the only way to liquidate assets like this would be to sell most of the assets with the stipulation that the purchaser could not take possession until the death of the father. So when the son sells them, he says, I've got $1,000 worth of stuff, but you can't, Alex, I'm selling it to you. You can't take possession until my father died. So will you give me $600 for it right now? Just so you're kind of, it's a long-term investment, but the seller has to kind of sell short because the person at the time of purchase isn't getting any value for it. The prodigal would virtually have to sell his birthright in garage sale fashion on the futures market. Everything would be so heavily discounted that the vast majority of the value would be sacrificed in the process. He would be fortunate to get the equivalent of pennies on the dollar. In reality, he probably settled for much, much less. He just wanted out. And again, we read, he asked for his inheritance, Father gave it to him. We just go, oh, that's weird. Jesus' listeners would have heard all of that. Would have been, wait, what did he just do? And the dad went along with it, and then the kid cashed it all out and just took off. He just wants to go. And I think what Jesus is pointing out here is the foolishness of jumping into sin, of deciding this is how I want to, because the listeners would have went, oh, wait now, nobody would ever do this. Nobody would ever be this stupid as this kid is being. But that's Jesus' point. He's saying, look how silly it is when you walk away from everything the Father has given you and decide, I want to live this way. Jesus is making a dramatic point with this son's terrible decisions. He's saying, and again, this will all come together in the end. When I listen to any of these parables, I always wonder what the average guy in the audience hearing this is thinking at this point, going, wait, now what's going on here? What's the story here?
Another thing, he's just being so selfish and unresponsible. He's walking away from a third of the work.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot to be done.
Yeah, he's walking away from family. He's walking away from responsibility. He's walking, and as we'll see in a minute, he's also walking away from his heritage. He is literally turning his back on everything. But I think that's what Jesus wants us to see in this. That when you're in the relationship with God, when you're in the Father's house, in other words, and you walk away, you're just as stupid as this kid. I mean, sorry, you're not supposed to say stupid, but you're being just as foolish as this kid is being. And Jesus' listeners at this point, and, I don't know if they're putting it together or not, but they're obviously going to be stunned by what this kid is doing. Look at Romans chapter 2. Romans chapter 2. And like I said, we've all heard stories, and maybe you have this story. I mean, I know this story probably too well, of the kid who has a good life and decides he wants to go be an idiot and live somewhere, do some stupid things. And we know how, I mean, you hear all the time how this works out, and it usually doesn't end well. I think of a guy I knew in college that got some grant money that he didn't expect to get and was all excited about it, and then he was just gone for like 5 days, and it didn't end well. And it's just like, and I always think of him when I think of this prodigal, because it's like, give me all my money, I'm going to go do whatever I want to do, and things go badly. Romans chapter 2, verse 4 says, or do you despise the riches of his kindness, restraint, and patience, not recognizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? I think that verse really kind of sums up what we're seeing with this young man. He's rejecting his father's kindness, his father's goodness, because what he wants to do is go do what he wants to do. As Cheryl said, he's being incredibly selfish with this And that's really, like I said, I think Jesus is painting a pretty graphic picture of sin. But now, even with the next thing Jesus says, he kind of turns up the disgust meter on this for the listeners. Because he says he goes into a faraway country, or to a far country. Israel is a small area. It's not a very big place. So if you go to a small area, I gave you the answer. If you go to a faraway place, where are you going? You're going to a Gentile nation. You're going to a place that doesn't believe what you believe. You're going to a place that doesn't conduct themselves the way you conduct yourself. So again, he's turning his back on family, responsibility, work, but he's also turning his back on his heritage, his culture, his faith. I mean, the Jewish nation is a theocracy. It is your nation is your religion. Your religion is your nation. And to go to a far country means he's just going, I'm done with all of it. And again, Jesus' listeners would have heard that. There are other places in Scripture where the concept of someone being far away is a way to paint the picture of someone having a lot of distance from God. In fact, in Peter's sermon in Acts chapter 2, he says that this is to those of you who are far off. It's that idea of anything far away from the center of what Judaism is. It's the center of where God's people at that time were, is a place outside of a relationship with God. So when he says he's going to a faraway place, to a far country, the listeners at this point would be aghast. This would be unthinkable. I mean, as the story of this kid grows in these short phrases Jesus is talking about, the listeners have to be going, the point of the story has got to be, and then lightning strikes this kid and he dies on the road. I mean, that's how it's got to end. Because everybody listening has got to be thinking, this kid's terrible. He's got to be the villain of this story. We're not sure how this is all going to end. And another thing, too, that I think we have to think about more when we read Scripture. If I'm going to read this parable to you, I'm going to say, a man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me. So he distributed the assets. Is that how you talk? If I'm going to tell you a story, I'm going to tell you, well, last night we went over and we did this, and then we did this, and I'm going to phrase it, I'm going to space it out. I'm going to give you some time to process. We don't do Scripture justice sometimes when we read. I mean, I'm bad as anybody. When we read as fast as we can. Because that's not how we talk. So you have to picture, too, when Jesus says this, a certain man had 2 sons. The younger came to him and said, Father, give me my share of the inheritance. You have to think, maybe Jesus stopped right there and let that sink in for a second. And you just imagine the crowd going, I can't believe this is a stupid story already. I mean, this thing's going to end terribly. So as Jesus builds this, I kind of can picture Jesus letting this stuff kind of sink in. As he says these, and he says, and he got all his money, he cashed it all out and took off. And the people go, oh man, what a terrible kid. And then he journeyed into a far country. Oh, I cannot, this is just getting worse. And that's exactly what he's doing. Jesus is just making this thing get worse. So, let's pause for a minute here for a second. Because what we know is there are more people involved in this story. As Jesus is telling this, all he has said is a certain man had 2 sons, and then he focuses on the younger. So as we're extrapolating all this information, one thing we have to think, and I don't know if the crowd would jump to this or not. We have this luxury because we can look back at it and spread it out like this. Where's the older brother? I mean, you would think you'd think if Jesus wasn't setting this whole thing up to then get to the older brother, that maybe he would have said, the son said, give me my inheritance, and the older brother came and begged him, please don't insult our father like this. Our father loves you. Stay home. I love you. You're my little brother. How many of you have younger siblings? You watch out for them sometimes? How many of you are the youngest? Do your siblings sometimes watch out for you? I mean, when I was in college in those days, my brother lived about 30 miles away. And a couple of times he called me, and my brother's 14 years older than me. He was a national champion wrestler. He's a big boy. He's a little short guy, but he's a big boy. There were several times where it was, he'd call me, or he'd call and leave a message. I'd go call him back, and it was, hey, how you doing? I hear, Mom's upset about this with you. And it was really nice. And then he'd get to the end and it'd be like, I'll come kill you if I have to. And it was like, you watch out for your siblings. In a normal situation, you would think we'd see something about we know he exists because Jesus already said there's two sons. But there's nothing from the older son.
But Clint, he got his share of the inheritance at the same time.
Exactly. He's also got his. And his is twice what the younger brother got. Now, what we don't have is he didn't cash his out at this point. So his is still functioning. But what we see is we don't hear anything from him until verse 25. Till we've already set the whole scene. We've seen the ruin. We'll get to that eventually, but we've already seen the ruin of the younger brother. And then the older brother shows up. Where has he been? Why didn't he defend his father? Why didn't he make a big deal about what a terrible situation this is? Keep in mind who Jesus is painting the older brother to be. Now, the Jewish leaders are listening to this, and at this point, they're just sick about this younger brother. They're like, this better end in a train wreck or something. I mean, this better end with this kid dead on the road somewhere. But the older brother, this guy apparently has no relationship with the father either. Because he would, like Tommy said, he's got his inheritance. So the father had to say, hey, boys, come here. We're going to have to do this. And it's a pain in the neck, but little Billy's got to have his money. So, Johnny, you're going to have to get yours too. Why doesn't he say, wait a minute, brother, this is terrible. Do not do this. Again, one of Jesus' subtle points. We don't even see the brother. We don't even see him having interaction with the father, with the younger brother. He's standing off distance. In fact, when we meet him, he's been out in the field. He knows what's going on in the family, but he's just doing his thing, which is, that's acceptable. He's doing his job.
What would they be doing if they had, having an inheritance? The father passes, then the two brothers would just farm the land? I don't understand just what would be the right thing to do, because how come he got, why can't the older brother wait for his dad to die and then he gets the things he's supposed to be doing? Where do you find that?
What Linda's asking is about why can't the older brother just wait? Well, the older brother could just wait. And really that's what, if you really delved into what's happening here, the older brother is just staying there and working. So his share, he knows what it is already. It's just going to keep gaining value. What the younger brother basically asks is, we own that barn, these cows, this whatever, that's worth $5,000. Give me that, and I'll sell it to somebody. I'll let somebody in the village know that here's the things you can buy from me. When my father dies, they're yours, which you're not supposed to do. But he said, when my father dies, they're yours if you'll give me $2,500 for them right now. The older brother is just staying home going, I have all the rest of this, and I'm just going to keep it, and it's going to keep gaining value. And he's really not doing anything, and that's the point. He's not doing anything wrong. The older brother isn't doing anything bad. He's staying at home, but he's also not defending his father. He's also not getting into this situation saying, none of this should be happening. This seems like a very dysfunctional family. Maybe not the father, but the boys, the picture this paints is, it doesn't seem like either of these boys have much of a relationship with each other or with their father. What is the point I think Jesus is trying to make is that one of these boys is blatant. One of them is flagrantly dishonoring his father and goes into a faraway place. The other one is subtly dishonoring his father while staying right at home. And that's scary. But that's the point Jesus is making. He's talking about the one who stays, the one who looks to be doing all the right things, has just as bad a relationship with the Father as the younger one. So, the older brother still hasn't appeared yet. So let's go back to the prodigal. He's gone. He's ready to go. He's ready for the party. He's ready for life to get started. And we don't know how long this takes. This is one of the details we obviously don't have. We don't know how long it is. But things go south. Things go bad as soon, not very long after he leaves. We don't know where he goes. That's not what Jesus doesn't. We don't need that. But what we can deduce is that he just went looking for fun. He wanted his money. He was going to go enjoy life. He was going to go sow his wild oats. He was looking for pleasure. He wanted to have fun. He was tired of farm life. He didn't want to do this junk anymore. He wanted to go do his thing. It says that he squandered. Some translations use the word, what do other translations say in verse 13? He squandered his living. What other translations say? In chapter 15, verse 13. Wasted? Any other words? The Greek word there is diascorpizo, which literally means threw to the wind. So we read squandered or wasted, and that means that makes a picture for us. But again, to me, Jesus saying he took his father's money and he threw it to the wind. On the old King James says on riotous living. That he went and did what he wanted to do. He wasted his family fortune. Now, the older brother makes a comment later in, verse 30? Yeah, verse 30. The older brother says, but when this son of yours came who has devoured your assets with prostitutes, you slaughtered the fat calf. Now, we don't have the detail of how he spent his money. The older brother says he devoured your livelihood with prostitutes, with harlots. We don't know that, and maybe that's the older brother making a leap, but Jesus doesn't correct him. He doesn't say, the father said, no, he didn't spend it, he got robbed. He doesn't correct that. So the idea of he devoured your livelihood is a great way to look at it. The kid went off to this foreign country, this faraway place, and just blew through the money, doing whatever he did. I mean, we can use, like I said, when I said the kid moves to Las Vegas, some of you laughed. I know what you're thinking. I mean, that's what we're thinking here, is the kid went and did things he shouldn't be doing, and he blew through the money. Sub-lesson in all of this, I think, I believe, I don't know if Jesus is teaching this, but I think it's there, is this type of lifestyle is going to lead to ruin. Maybe not immediately, maybe not, I mean, certainly not always as fast as happened to this young man. But even if it's in eternity, choosing to live this sort of lifestyle is going to lead to your ultimate ruin. What does Romans 3:23 tell us? The wages of sin is what? Death. Romans 8 verse 13 says, 8 verse 13 says, because if you live according to the flesh, you're going to die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. James 1:15 tells us, then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death. The fast track this kid went on is just is a short summary of choosing to live this kind of lifestyle. And like I said, I don't know that this is part of Jesus' intention, but I think he makes the point that this kid went off and lived a terrible life, and it's going to end very poorly for him. When we make the choice to jump into sin, it's never going to work out for us. And I say that, and maybe some of you are thinking, well, yeah, but what about this person? What about this person who has a terrible life, and they're rich and famous and have everything? even if it's in eternity. I mean, that sounds like a bad way to say it, but eventually it's going to lead to ruin. And this snapshot of this kid's life shows this, that the choice, and maybe in our case, it's even more clear, the choice to walk away from the Father's house, to walk away from our faith, to go live a life that is outside of what God has intended for us, is never going to end well. And that's part of the picture we get from this guy. And then, as Jesus goes into this, and again, you have to think he's at this verse where he said, he goes off into this foreign country and he runs through the money and all this stuff happens. The crowd is not happy, especially the Jewish leaders. And then I kind of picture a little pause right here. And then verse 14. He's just said he squandered his estate in foolish living, riotous living, immoral living, whatever your translation says. And then, verse 14, after he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he had nothing.
This reminds me of Jonah.
Yeah.
That the Pharisees are going to say, like Jonah, when he ran from God, got thrown into that storm, and because of his sin, he put all these people in danger in that storm.
Yeah.
Thrown himself out. To me, the Pharisees are going to see this famine as not just unlucky, but it's going to be because of the kid's sin.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because that's how, that's about the son. He was happy to be the center of attention. Now he's not. This famine, that's exactly what Adam was saying. This idea, with Jonah, it's really cut and dry, because Jonah even says, "This is."
I'm the reason why you're having the storm. Throw me over.
Toss me over. Jesus' listeners, especially the religious leaders, when we get to this famine part, there they would be going, uh-huh. I mean, it's the twist the mustache laugh here at this point. Because this is what they've been waiting for. Now this kid is getting his comeuppance. Now he's getting what he deserves. This would be seen in the same way as Jonah being thrown over. This is a divinely orchestrated, he's cashing the check now. That now that he's done this, now that he's chosen to live this way, they might even think, okay, now this Jesus guy is starting to make sense finally. This story is starting to come together, where now we can agree with this. The application, I think, that we can take, kind of going back to that last point, the freedom this young man wanted is not working out the way he thought it was going to work out. In fact, he's now in the middle of just a horrible situation. In fact, the way it's even phrased, it says after he spent everything, the famine hits, and then the last phrase says, and he had nothing. He has nothing. Now, Jesus certainly doesn't have to give any explanation of the famine, especially in that day. The Jewish people, I mean, it's part of their history. You could look at 2 Kings chapter 6, where the king of Syria surrounds Jerusalem and basically causes a famine, if you will. And, I mean, they're eating babies. Seriously, that sounds terrible, but that's what they're doing. Because it's so terrible. You can think of, for the Jews, they would think of the famine that caused Joseph's family to have to go into Egypt, that became their Egyptian captivity, the kind of the cornerstone of the Jewish faith, if you will. God taking them out of Egypt. The famine.
Those famines are caused by God.
Yeah.
You think about that famine. Joseph never becomes the second in line to Pharaoh and gets to be able to distribute all the food and bring his father's family into Egypt, right? So if I'm a Pharisee and I see famine, I think, oh, this is God's fingerprint.
Exactly. That's the image that I think they would get too, is they would see this as God's work. Because God uses famines in those ways. it's seen as a providential thing, that God's doing this. God's manipulating the scene here in some way or another. It's either a punishment or a long-term plan. For this son, they would see this as he's getting what he deserves. Being without completely is hard for us to imagine. I mean, it just is. We just don't get that. I have a list. You think of the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, 50s. A third of the population killed. There's a famine in North Korea in the mid-90s where, because we can't get correct numbers, anywhere from 250,000 to 3.5 million died. I mean, famines still happen. You think of commercials you've seen raising money for starving kids. A lot of those are because of famine. Those are the images these people would hear or would get in their heads. When Jesus says a famine hit and he had nothing, they would understand this kid is in desperate straits now. So for this kid, at this point, the party's over. It went fast. It was a good run, maybe in his mind, but it's not now. When we think of the situation he's in now, the plight that he is in, and we'll get into that more next week, but it is, for the listeners, and I always wonder what the average guy is thinking. I mean, is there somebody in the crowd going, oh man, this kid's in trouble? Or all of them going, yep. Because right now you can just imagine the Jewish leaders going, this is how this should have ended. And he's in the worst possible situation he can be in, we think, because it actually gets a little bit worse even for this kid. That phrase, he had nothing, I think is kind of what I want to leave you with this morning in a sad way. But think of that. He had everything. Kid was raised had a family, had a job, had an inheritance coming. He had everything. And he walks away from it and he gets to the point where he had nothing. I think Jesus gives us a picture of what sin does. That when we decide to walk away and give that up, we decide to separate ourselves from our Father in that way, we have nothing. What we'll see next week is what I think is one of the greatest sections of Jesus' parables. Because we'll see a turning point that another book, if you want some book recommendations, the book called Aha by Kyle Idleman is a great book, and he does a great job with this whole scene. But we'll see the son's turning point. And it's not what the Jewish leaders will expect. And it's not going to make them happy as things improve, sort of, for this son. Any thoughts? Okay, we'll pick up with our poor kid next week.